almost all the architecture that we know today of globalism, of global governance, was born in the aftermath of World War II. Whether you're looking at the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, even the European Union. And over the next few decades, that rapidly morphed into this super state that we know today as the European Union, that in many ways has more power than the federal government does. They understand that war is an accelerator for the cause of globalism. So I think war is a very real possibility, and I think it would absolutely serve the interests of those who are trying to undermine national sovereignty and reshape the global order.
This is Little by Little with Andy Schechtman.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Little by Little. I'm very excited to have with me Alex Newman, an award-winning international journalist, educator, author, speaker, TV and radio host, consultant who seeks to glorify God in everything. In addition to his role as senior editor of the New American magazine and host of the New American's nationally syndicated radio show Behind the Deep State, Alex serves as the president of Liberties Sentinel Media, which is where I'm familiar from reading some of your work. Alex, I'm very happy to have you here. Thanks for dropping in. How you doing?
Doing great. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. Pleasure is mine. We'll jump right into it. There are a lot of things I want to ask you. Over the last several years, let's go back to the previous administration. I was very vocal. I was very vocal about things that had, in essence, completely rewritten our culture, moving away from meritocracy to lifestyle choices, which was a big one for me. The open borders, the election interference, the wokeness, the lawlessness, all of these things I thought were far more disturbing to me, and I was very adamant in public about it, than the fiscal irresponsibility and the mismanagement of our monetary policy, which was bad enough as it is. And you, through my reading of some of your work and listening to some of your podcasts, have been was a very vocal critic to the Biden administration. You called it part of a broader globalist effort to erode American sovereignty and traditional values, and I couldn't say it better myself. My question to you is this: if Kamala Harris had stepped into the presidency, where do you think we'd be today?
It's a very good question. I suspect the economy would be in far worse shape than it is now. I expect and this may sound like I'm just being melodramatic, but I expect that we would probably see a lot of well-known freedom fighters actually prosecuted and jailed. I spoke with some very high-profile, very well-known individuals from the conservative nonprofit world, even from the political world, who literally and seriously believed that if Kamala Harris had won, they were going to be thrown in jail for climate denial, for supporting January 6th too vociferously. So I think we dodged a bullet. I don't think we're entirely out of the woods yet, but I think if Kamala Harris had been elected, we probably would have seen revolutionary level change, with a goal of making it impossible to ever turn back. So they would have tried to provide amnesty for the tens of millions of illegal aliens they let in, put them on a path to voting, basically do to the nation what they did to California, create a permanent Democrat voting bloc that could never be overcome. And from there, it would be very, very rapid. The governor of California has already very publicly, with support from the legislature, started calling for a constitutional convention to, they're saying it's just to repeal the Second Amendment, but I suspect they have much, much broader goals than that. And so I think that's the kind of direction we would head in. It would be an effort to uproot the old system of government, our constitutional Republican form of government, and replace it with something much more akin to what we see in, say, Western Europe. So.
Like the Cloward-Piven theory, maybe, but something I talked about quite a bit as well, especially the part of, bringing in a serfdom, reining in a serfdom of loyal voters who would never, ever vote Republican ever again. And I applaud you for having the courage to say these things, because I agree with you completely and totally. And along those lines, a lot of what you talk about is the globalist agenda. President Trump at least appears to be pushing back. I have said publicly that if we don't question everything, even those things that look legitimate, then over the last 4 years, we probably didn't learn anything. And so my question to you is, are there still threats flying under the radar that perhaps most Americans are missing, even those who believe President Trump is pure in his motivations?
No question about it. And in fact, I think it would be very foolish and naive to think that all the threats suddenly evaporated on January 20th. And I'm not one of those people who gets into cheerleader mode and says, Trump uber alles, Trump can do no wrong, Trump is the de facto savior of America. I'm glad he got elected. I think he's been doing a lot of good things, but I think it would be very foolish not to examine each policy with just an open mind, right? We don't have to agree. We're not Democrats. We don't have to agree with every single thing dear leader does to be patriotic. I'm very pleased with a lot of what he's done. I've followed the climate issue for 15 years now in my journalistic career, and I could not have designed a better program myself to smash this machinery. Now, will we succeed in smashing it? That remains to be seen. Right now, all of it has really been through the executive branch, and we need congressional action to get these things made permanent. But there are plenty of things that I think are deeply concerning. Just last week, I wrote an article about his executive order injecting artificial intelligence into every classroom in America. He campaigned on a platform of getting the U.S. government out of education. I think that was a good step in the right direction. But now we're seeing efforts to, once again, have federal interference in the classroom. And frankly, I think there are some really serious dangers from AI. I understand where the president's coming from. This is a very powerful new technology that is going to have a profound impact on the future. We want our children to be familiar with these technologies. We want our children to know how to use them. But there are some really, really serious dangers there. On the economic front, I think there's a risk that the globalists, the evildoers, whatever you want to call them, will try to collapse the economy and blame Donald Trump, whether that be through collapsing the U.S. dollar, collapsing the stock market, collapsing the real estate market, doing all of the above at the same time. I think any of those are real possibilities. And also, of course, the threat of World War III. I do believe that Donald Trump is trying hard to negotiate peaceful solutions to these problems. But as we've seen, there's new flare-ups every day. Now the Indians, I just got back from India a week and a half ago. Now the Indians are launching missiles into Pakistan. The Pakistanis are plotting their retaliation and supposedly backing terrorist attacks. So it's a big mess. You look at Ukraine, Russia, you look at what's going on in the Middle East, now the big attack on Yemen. Any one of these could easily spiral into a third world war. And we know there are very powerful forces that want a third world war. So I was pleased to see Mike Waltz escorted out of the senior role in the national security apparatus. That was an encouraging sign to me. But there are still snakes in the administration where we have some people that I think need to be watched very, very closely. And so, no, by no means has the danger passed. In fact, we may be in an even more dangerous spot right now because so many Americans who otherwise would be paying close attention and resisting evil are now going back to sleep and just cheerleading. And I'll mention one more major risk that I see, and that is an effort, I think, to stir up a civil war in this country. A lot of people who are Trump supporters don't see it because we've all kind of been segregated into our online social media ghettos, and they don't see the incredible anger, the fury, the rage that is building on the other side. And a lot of it is based on fake news. The fake media is stirring them up. The politicians are stirring them up. Trump is going to take your rights away. Trump is going to force you to carry babies. Trump is going to put LGBT people like it's all ridiculous. But the blue-haired weirdo ready to burn down the city doesn't know that. And so I think there really is an effort to stir up a civil war in this country to try to force Trump to respond as the dictator that they're trying to portray him as. So we've got all these major risks, and I think people would be wise to pay close attention.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't say it better. I think people need to hear your message, Alex. I've been trying to say it. I can't say it quite as eloquently as you are, but I see those things clearly, and think that was very well said. As a matter of fact, I hope people rewind that and listen to that again. I mean, it seems that things are feeling, to your point, increasingly unstable as a result of this divisiveness. And I say that from a standpoint of economically, culturally, spiritually. In your view, are we witnessing the decline of American exceptionalism, or is this a necessary, call it refining moment for this nation?
Well, I think there's several ways to look at this. My assessment of the situation we're in is we were witnessing the controlled demolition of the United States of America in every important respect. Right? I mean, it doesn't mean that the lines on the map would cease to exist. It doesn't mean that the federal government would cease to exist. But the America that we knew and loved was deliberately being destroyed. And I don't just mean Joe Biden, right? This has been a long-term process. It's been a bipartisan process. Whether you're looking at the Bushes, Mr. George H.W. New World Order Bush, or, even before that, going all the way back to Eisenhower. I mean, there has been a very deliberate and I believe strategic effort to use the United States to hijack our political, economic, and military power to rearrange the world order in a particular way. And now that process has largely been accomplished, the United States becomes suddenly an obstacle to the final destination that these people see. And again, this isn't speculation. If you read their documents, if you listen to their speeches, they're pretty open about this. They want what George H.W. Bush called the New World Order, where a credible United Nations would use its peacekeeping role, in other words, their military forces, to bring about the vision of the UN's founders. Anybody can go find out what the vision of the UN's founders were, right? You had the Soviets, then you had our guy, Al Jarhis, who we eventually threw in prison because he was a spy for Joseph Stalin. We knew what their vision was. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles wrote about it in his book in 1950, War or Peace, that the goal was eventually to turn the UN into a world government with teeth in it, as he phrased it in his book. So that's the plan. And if you look at the world order that they themselves say they want to build, it is not compatible with the principles that the United States was founded on. I mean, just go back to read the Declaration of Independence. They said it was a self-evident truth that God created us equally, that he endowed us with certain unalienable rights. None of those ideas are compatible with the kind of global political, economic, and even religious system that these people want to impose on us. And that means that America is officially an obstacle. And so we have seen now over at least a 40-year period, an effort to deindustrialize the United States, an effort to ship our productive capabilities over to communist China, over to other parts of the world, even Mexico, by the way. And I don't say that with any animosity to Mexico or even the Chinese. I grew up overseas. I've been overseas almost all my life. It's just an objective fact. American policymakers have deliberately undermined our economy. They've deliberately destroyed the middle class that was once vibrant and the backbone of resistance to tyranny. And that's the goal that they're moving toward. Now, will they be able to jump into the one world system in one go? No, they won't. But what they're trying to do right now is undermine what's left of the United States. And I do believe Trump is trying to push back on this. So we saw this struggle even in 2016. They were saying, well, America is over. The days of prosperity are over. We're never going to be energy independent again. Trump managed to turn around on a dime. We became energy exporters, net exporters for the first time since Eisenhower in a matter of just a couple of years. So it's possible to reverse this, but this engineered decline is not happening organically. Again, I think controlled demolition is the best metaphor. And they're not giving up just because Donald Trump is the president. I think, again, he's holding them back. He's kind of hit the pause button. We may have a little bit of a reprieve here, but eventually there's going to be another election. And eventually we're going to have another deep state puppet in the White House. And I think that process will resume unless important safeguards are put into place right now while we have the opportunity to do it.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask you about that. Just dawned on me the last question you talked about World War III. I did an interview with Martin Armstrong last week. He told me his biggest concern is a false flag event where NATO is dragged into a war with Russia. I mean, what kind of stock do you put in that kind of a statement, that kind of a threat? Is that something that concerns you? You mentioned World War III. Hopefully Trump has his eyes on this, but do you see some sort of an event? Just like you mentioned, they want to bring down the economy, bring down the stock market, blame it on Trump. How about some sort of a false flag event that drags NATO into, what is it, Article 5, I think it's called Article 5, into some sort of a hot war with Russia?
I think that is eventually the plan, right? And whether it starts with a real or a false flag event is really immaterial. There are very powerful forces, not just in Russia, not just in China, but even here in the United States, that are hoping to see a major catastrophic global war. And that's not my opinion. Again, if you go back to the early 1960s, the U.S. State Department hired a guy called Lincoln Bloomfield to write a report. And all you really need to know is the title of the report. It kind of gives the whole agenda away. It's called A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations. And the goal of this report was to figure out how do we get from where we were then, right, basically the Westphalian system, going back to the mid 1600s of sovereign or relatively sovereign nation states, to the kind of system that they wanted, which was a world effectively controlled by the United Nations. And in this report, he outlines his views on the best ways to make that happen. He says that through organic processes, this would take hundreds of years to get us there. But he says there's a way to short circuit the process and accelerate it very dramatically. And he says the most important tools to bring that about: war, the threat of war, and crises. So when the World Economic Forum talks about a polycrisis, potentially involving an economic collapse, a third world war, environmental disasters, etc., we need to take these people very, very seriously. Now, there's several angles to look at this from, right? I believe the plan is for the United States to lose the Third World War. And I don't believe very many people, even who are involved in the execution of this plan, understand it fully. But there's a couple of facts that I think are really important to kind of understand the whole puzzle that we're looking at here. One document that I would refer people to that I think is especially critical to understanding what's happening here are the books that were released by, I believe, the most important Soviet defector of all time. His name was Anatoly Golitsyn. He defected from the Soviet Union. He was a high-ranking officer in KGB's Department D, which was the disinformation department. And he said that back in the 1960s and even into the 70s, they were working on long-range disinformation plans. And he gave many examples. The so-called Sino-Soviet split was a very obvious one, right, where the Soviets and the Communist Chinese pretended to be at odds with each other. And then Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon went in and said, oh, we'll be friends with China to contain the Soviet Union. I mean, what an idiotic thing. Hard to imagine that Americans fell for that, but they did. And in these two books, it's called New Lies for Old and the Perestroika Deception. He first told the CIA, the FBI, Canadian intelligence, they were not interested. So he finally went to the American people with this and put these two books out in the early 1980s. He gave a series of over 200 predictions, about 205, maybe 206, very specific predictions about what was going to happen based on his insider knowledge from Department D and the KGB. And of those 205, 206 predictions, about 200 have come true to the letter. He even gave names of people who were going to be involved in this. He said there would be fake anti-communist revolutions across Eastern Europe. He said the Soviet Union would collapse, but all the communist evildoers would remain in power, right? This wasn't like the denazification process where Nazi war criminals were hung or had to escape to South America. The Soviets just rebranded themselves, right? They went from communist commissar to businessman and picked up state assets for pennies on the dollar, and suddenly they're billionaires, right? Same people, same control, just a slightly new mask. So he predicted that all of this was going to happen. Again, he even gave names, people like Lech Walesa in Poland, who's known as this big anti-communist hero, the leader of the Solidarity movement. Now we know from Soviet documents his code name was Bolek. He was a Soviet agent. So a lot of this was orchestrated in advance. And the reason I'm bringing all this up is because he talks about the grand finale here in these books. And the final prediction, which has not come true yet, obviously, is what he describes as a 2nd October revolution, where the Communist Chinese, the Russians, and their allies around the world, once they are sufficiently strong, then once they have the ability to take down the United States of America, would join forces, and there would be a catastrophic, devastating war that would take out the weakened and degenerate United States. And I believe there is a carefully orchestrated plan to make that a reality. I don't think it's out of the question that we could see nuclear bombs drop on America from Russia. Now, will that happen next week? I don't know. Could it happen next week? Absolutely. So I think we're in great danger. And I don't say that to scare people. I say that because these things are important to understand if you want to try to get a sense of where the world is going. And I don't think it's too late to stop them necessarily. But Donald Trump needs to be very careful. Again, he's got snakes in his administration who I think would very much like to see a war with Russia. Maybe not because they're conspirators in some big design, but because they think that's the best policy for the United States. But this is a very precarious situation. And the Russians have made very clear that if they feel the existence of the Russian state is threatened, they will use nuclear weapons. They have said it as loudly and as clearly as they possibly can. So this is nothing to mess around with. And if it doesn't happen with Russia, you know, they could start it off in the Middle East, right? It might start with Iran. It might start with North Korea, right? EMP attack. There's all kinds of different ways that they could kick this process off. And the eventual goal would be to use the fallout from this Third World War to finally and forever abolish the concept of national sovereignty. And they've got a track record. If you look back, World War I was hugely successful from the perspective of advancing globalism. Millions of people dead. All the men went and died in the wars. The women were out of the homes and the factories to make the bullets so that the men could fight in the war. The children suddenly ended up in government schools so they could be indoctrinated to believe all this stuff. And the result was the League of Nations. Right? The only reason that didn't take off was because the U.S. Senate said no. After World War II, which, by the way, Rockefellers, the Morgan interests were deeply involved in financing the Nazi war. Even some of the Bushes, right? We go back and look at Senator Prescott Bush, director of Union Bank in New York, busted under the Trading with the Enemy Act for helping to finance the Nazis. What happened after World War II was almost all the architecture that we know today of globalism, of global governance, was born in the aftermath of World War II. Whether you're looking at the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, even the European Union, right? The European coal and steel community was born in the aftermath of World War II, and over the next few decades, that rapidly morphed into this super state that we know today as the European Union, that in many ways has more power than the federal government does. So, they understand that war is an accelerator for the cause of globalism. And I'll say one more thing and then hand it back to you, Andy. One of the other things that he calls for in this report is a process of regionalization, and war can help advance that as well. We're actually watching this happen right now in Europe. Vladimir Putin is saying, oh, look at those terrible Europeans, look at terrible NATO. We need to deepen our integration through the Eurasian Union. So Kazakhstan and Armenia, you guys all need to join forces with us, and we're going to create a super state to rival the European Union. Meanwhile, the Europeans and NATO are saying, oh, man, look at those terrible Russians, invading Ukraine. We're going to be next. We need to have a single European Union military. We need to bring all of our policies together in Brussels and through NATO. So in both cases here, we see these regional governments that Lincoln Bloomfield advocated, that Henry Kissinger advocated in his book World Order, that Zbigniew Brzezinski, National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter, Trilateral Commission founder, advocated for very publicly. So I think war is a very real possibility, to just summarize really quick. And I think it would absolutely serve the interests of those who are trying to undermine national sovereignty and reshape the global order.
I wish I didn't agree with you. And to put a little exclamation point on that, the president of Belarus has called for a summit recently to integrate the Eurasian Economic Union, all of the countries that end in stan, like Kazakhstan, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization into the BRICS, who are now have over 40 countries that have expressed interest and or have formally applied, Vietnam being the last. Indonesia has just become a full member of it. Something came out recently to support what you're saying. We see the former rivals now forming a united front with China, Japan, South Korea, and many of the ASEAN nations, the countries in Southeast Asia, have jointly committed to reducing dollar dependence, expanding trade in local currencies, and resisting U.S.-centric protectionism. That was the official statement. These are countries that typically and traditionally have been rivals. And it's interesting because the week before that, the People's Bank of China talked about connecting its digital RMB cross-border settlement system to 10 of the ASEAN countries and 6 Middle Eastern nations, which make up 38% of global trade. This is the mBridge platform that takes 7 seconds to settle outside of SWIFT instead of the 3 to 5 days on SWIFT without the SWIFT interference. All of that's big. But then you see that the Russian foreign minister come out and say that this SWIFT or this bridge system will be open to non-BRICS nations as well. You put in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, and the Belt and Road Initiative, all aligned with China and Russia. You end up talking 90% of human population, 3 of the 4 largest nuclear arsenals in the world, the majority of the on-land and on-sea shipping routes, the majority of all of the commodities, both hard and soft, the 100% of the refining of rare earths. I mean, to your point, you can see it little by little by little. They are, and no pun intended with the name of the show, they are putting that together, a force to be reckoned with and not to be taken without anything but 100% seriousness. Let's just hope to God that that final prediction does not come true, because you can see we are kind of being exiled in all of this as all of these countries are rallying together against the Western hegemony, and to see rivals becoming allies is something rather interesting and frightening in the frame of what you're saying. I don't know if you have any comments on that at all.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's so interesting, and I have followed all these developments very, very closely. In fact, I've lived in a lot of the BRICS countries. I've been to all of them except China because I figure the regime there wouldn't be happy if I showed up. But if you look at the world order that they are publicly calling for, it's exactly the same kind of vision that we see expressed by the Western globalists, right? For example, the G77 plus China. This is the largest alliance, a block of governments within the UN General Assembly. They call it G77. It's actually about 134 governments now, including Communist China. They control the vast majority of the world's population, a huge segment of the world economy. They met about a decade ago in Bolivia for the Toward a New World Order to Live Well conference. The Secretary General of the UN at the time was there, Ban Ki-moon. And I encourage people to just go read this declaration. Right? They call for empowering the United Nations in global governance, having the UN take over persecution or prosecution of terrorism. They call for turning the UN into an instrument of economic global governance. And if you read the BRICS declarations that they come out with every year, same thing, right? They call for turning the UN into the UN General Assembly into an emblem of global sovereignty. And so this world order that is being built, they want to frame it as like an East versus West kind of thing. And in one way it kind of is. The problem is the alleged leaders of the West have deliberately brought this situation about. They have deliberately built up communist China into a superpower with a military that now very easily rivals the military of the United States of America. They've been destroying our economy and destroying our military while transferring that over to China under all kinds of different pretexts, right? First, it was containing the Soviet Union. The more recent one is the climate change, right? We're going to shut down our power plants. We're going to shut down our industry so we can ship them all to China. And somehow that's supposed to make the weather better. I mean, people are so unbelievably gullible. But this is all happening by design. And that's because the new system that they want is modeled on what's going on in communist China right now, right? And it's not exactly communism, right? A lot of people make the mistake of calling this communism just because it's run by the Communist Party of China. It is totalitarianism, very ruthless totalitarianism. Remember, the dictatorship in China has murdered more people than any government in the history of man. We're talking at least 100 million of their own people, not including the forced abortions. There's no other government in history that has been so murderous. The control they exercise over the estimated 1.5 billion people they rule is unlike anything we've ever seen in human history with the social credit scores. There is absolutely no freedom beyond that little bit that's allowed so that the economy doesn't collapse. That's the model they want for the world. That's why the middle class in America has been destroyed. That's why our industries and our technology have deliberately been shipped over to China under various pretexts. And that's why when we see this massive alliance forming, the Russians, the Chinese, the Brazilians, the South Africans, and you can see the connections between the Western globalists and the rise of these very governments to power. You go back far enough, you can actually watch the U.S. government betray the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek in China to bring Chairman Mao to power on purpose. George Marshall literally put in, he was the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War. He literally put an arms embargo on the freedom fighters in China, the nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek, for the purpose of bringing the communists to power. We have seen the same thing in South Africa. If you go back to the Bolshevik Revolution, incredible book by Anthony Sutton, one of the greatest historians in American history. He was at Stanford University. He shows that the banking interests on Wall Street literally funded the Bolshevik Revolution. So when you take all these pieces together, what's very clearly happening here is an effort to move away from the old system that was kind of the product of, Rome and Greece and the Bible and included things like the sanctity of life and the basic principles that are articulated in our Declaration of Independence. Thou shalt not steal, as in right to property. Thou shalt not murder, as in right to life. So just biblical concepts translated into government. They want all that to go by the wayside, and they want to usher in a new system. And so China is at once the model for this new system and also one of the key engines now moving the world toward that system with help from the UN. And again, I can't emphasize this strongly enough, with help for generations from top American policymakers and top American business interests.
That's kind of a mic drop right there. you mentioned you believe, and certainly after speaking with you, I really do appreciate your candor that Trump is pushing back against this. So I'll ask you this question under the context that he is pushing back against this behemoth machine, that when we say they, whoever they are, is the current financial system collapsing under its own weight, under its own contradictions, decades of suppressed interest rates, unchecked fiscal irresponsibility? Or is it being taken apart intentionally to pave the way for something more centralized and controlled? Now, frame that not in, is Trump trying to do this himself? Independent, does he have a vision independent, or is he part of the machine ultimately? I mean, is there anything that he's trying to do by bringing down the system that would set us free from this path?
It's a very good question, Andy. And I think, regardless of who exactly Trump is, I don't think we can exclude entirely the possibility that we've been deceived. Although after examining this for about 8 years, I do believe he's seriously trying to stop it. But you look at the economic system that we have right now, and really the monetary system in particular. And I taught economics for 12 years. This has been a fascination of mine since I was in college. It is going to end, right? It was unsustainable from the beginning. It's basically a fraud piled on top of a fraud piled on top of a fraud. And there is no way for this to continue in perpetuity. As you know very well, they create money as debt. They don't create the interest needed to pay back the loans when that money came into circulation through the purchase of bonds. And so this system cannot survive over the long term. And I think we're rapidly approaching the inevitable collapse of this system. And that brings us to a fork in the road. We can go, I think, one of two ways, and maybe there are subpaths on each of those two broad ways, but there are ultimately two ways we could move. We could move in the direction of more centralization, more of the same fraud, maybe repackaged and maybe with a few token concessions to humanity, but an effort to really move us toward a one world monetary system, a one world financial system. And that is ultimately the goal. There may be interim steps to get there, right? The European Union, I think, is a very relevant model when we're talking about steps on the way to that system, where a regional central bank, like the European Central Bank, usurps the monetary authority from the formerly sovereign governments. But I believe that's the way the globalists want to go. And I first started writing about this early on in my journalistic career. I did a cover story for the New American Magazine, I think back in like 2010, fresh out of journalism school, about the push for a one world currency. And they weren't hiding it. I had 20 UN reports saying we need a one world currency. I had IMF reports saying we need a one world currency. I had a report from the Chinese central bank saying we need a world currency. We should base it on the special drawing rights that the IMF it's already kind of a proto global currency, right? So that's what they want. They want to turn the IMF or some substitute for the IMF into a global central bank, kind of Federal Reserve style. Again, there may be some concessions to make people happy. Maybe we'll peg it to gold, or 10% will be gold, or whatever. Maybe some silly little token like that. Then the other option would be to restore sound money. And I do believe that Trump understands this far better than he lets on in public. And he's dropped some pretty strong hits. I mean, you go back to 2016 and you listen to him talking about gold and how our purchasing power has been eroded, and how wouldn't it be great to go back to the gold standard. A lot of people don't realize Trump was educated in some very important things by some very important people prior to getting involved in the political process. Roy Cohn is an interesting fellow. He had a long and weird career as a high-powered lawyer for mafia and others, but toward the end of his life, he repented of a lot of that stuff and got really active in the fight for freedom. In fact, he joined the board of the Western Goals Foundation, the largest private intelligence organization in the world, headed at that time by Congressman Larry McDonald, who was the chairman of the John Birch Society. His plane was shot down by a Soviet fighter jet in 1983. And so this was a good friend of Donald Trump's who mentored him on a lot of key things. And they knew everything, right? They had all the files on the subversive movements. They had a very good understanding of the monetary system. So you look at the things that Trump has said over the years. We should go back to the gold standard. He actually took payment for a big space of office space in one of his buildings in the shape of a gold bar. You look at some of the people he has brought around him, right? Judy Shelton, his nominee for the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. That was interesting, right? One of the better known advocates of sound money and gold gold bonds. So you get the sense that Trump does understand this much better than he lets on in public. And I would like to think, can't be sure, I don't have any secret inside information, but I would like to think that as this system draws to its inevitable close, there are very smart people working on a plan to move us back in the direction of sound money over the long term. Hearing him talk about the gold in Fort Knox, I mean, something is up. And again, I think we could go one of two ways. And now would be a really good time for everyday Americans to educate themselves on this. I have spoken with multiple members of Congress who are very enthusiastic about a return of the gold. Obviously, gold would have to be revalued, right? I mean, it couldn't be $3,000 an ounce, $3,300 an ounce, and have that back to U.S. dollar. There would have to be a major restructuring of the system. But I don't think that's out of the question, and I think there are some very influential people who also would like to see those things. But, the future's not written in stone yet, and so people ought to get involved.
Sorry about that. My dog was barking a few seconds ago. So I interviewed Judy. I love that you said that. She talked about the 50-year treasury. She told me that Trump would issue them next July 4th, the 250th year anniversary of the country, that he would issue gold-backed treasury. She said that on my interview, and that was part of their discussion. Of course, the United States, since Easter alone, has imported or delivered 34.5 tons of gold since Easter. We've become a net importer since November when he won. Scott Bessent, obviously, when he's a self-professed gold bug. When he was running the hedge fund, his largest position was gold. I wouldn't be surprised to see Judy in talks for taking over for Powell again when his tenure ends. And then you have his cryptic tweet that he put out on Easter, the golden rule of negotiation: he who has the gold makes the rules. Thank you. There is more than just a little bit of evidence to that. And you talk about gold being revalued. It's ironic. You can't make it up. Gold is held on the United States balance sheet and across the Western world in what is called the gold revaluation account. That's actually the name of it on the balance sheet. Certainly Roosevelt did it. He revalued gold in 1933, paid everyone $20.67 for their $20 gold coin. That was a lot of money. When a dozen eggs were a nickel, you got 67 cents. Of course, when Nixon closed the gold window in 71, he revalued it the following year from 35 to 38, and then the following year from 38 to 42.22, where it has sat on the balance sheet. So to your point, it has happened. Every $4,000 increase in the price of gold would give the Treasury General account $1 trillion free and clear. Guys like James Rickards talking about $24,000, $27,000 gold. Mike Maloney was saying $9,000 gold by taking M1 and dividing it into price of gold into the number of ounces of gold into M1. And I think the exact numbers that he put out, I wrote it down the other day. I thought it was very interesting. People should check it out. It is a neat deal he did. The numbers that he came up with, see if I can find it real quick. If I can't, I can't. But I think here it is. He said that M1 is $2.365 trillion divided by 261 million ounces. You get $9,044 an ounce. We're seeing everyone talk about this. It's held in the gold revaluation account. Trump seems to understand this as we become net importers. Massive deliveries on the COMEX every single month, more and more. I mean, yeah, it's interesting you say that. And I also, the question I was going to ask you, and I'll also frame it by saying I know you just wrote a piece in the Epoch Times about the states here in Florida, where we both live. They have just passed this new law that gold and silver are legal tender. We see that in Alabama. We're seeing it in Missouri, in Wyoming, in Utah, in Texas, in Alaska. I mean, there are states that are pushing back against the fiscal irresponsibility you speak of the brain-dead monetary policy. So the question I was going to ask you originally was, we're seeing unprecedented gold accumulation, by countries like China, India, and Russia, and now even the United States? Is gold quietly being reestablished as a foundation of a new global financial architecture? I think I know your answer, but I'd like to hear you expand on it if you don't mind. Then I'm going to ask you one last question, and I'm going to let you go.
Sure. Well, thank you. And it sure seems like central banks think it is, right? I mean, you look at central banks, and this is not even a new phenomenon. For years now, central banks have been importing and purchasing huge amounts of gold. For a while, the Western central banks were net sellers, but even that, I think, is starting to turn around. And so I think everybody is expecting something big to happen with gold. I don't know that anybody knows exactly where this is going. I think a lot of people have plans. I think Donald Trump is spending time thinking about this. Like you said, I think Scott Bessent and some of the folks in other governments are spending time thinking about this. I think the Chinese are spending a lot of time thinking about this right now, and the Russians and others. So it's hard to know where exactly this is all going to land, but it would be hard to imagine a monetary future that didn't include at least some role for gold, even if it was just a token role. In fact, we saw that recently in Zimbabwe, right? Zimbabwe, of course, destroyed the currency, endless money printing, totally destroyed the currency and the economy. And now they've put in kind of a token link to gold in the ZiG there. So I think it's possible we could see something like that. And if Donald Trump and some of the more clear-minded people in his administration get their way, I think we could see a move back toward real, honest money. Either of those, I think, would be a step in the right direction. I don't think having gold as a token component of some international or IMF SDR type program would be a good way forward, but it would certainly be good for gold. But I think that would be more of a ruse. But again, as I said, I think there's a chance that we could move in a good direction on monetary policy if Donald Trump plays his cards right and doesn't get deceived or duped or caught up in circumstances beyond our control.
Yeah, I agree. It's something big is happening with gold. I mean, it's reacting in a way that I've done this for 35 years. It's never reacted even close to this. And the suppression that we've talked about, when they would step on it in years past, it wouldn't come back. And now last week is a good example, fell by, almost $150 and then up $200 in 2 days. There is a demand for gold at levels above this retail level for sure, up in the central bank level, that is signaling if you're paying attention. I've done, 5,000 YouTube interviews in the past 4 or 5 years. You're one of the most interesting people I've ever spoken to, and how our paths haven't crossed yet personally baffles me, because you're right up my alley in the way that you think. I admire your intellect and the way you're putting together the pieces. So I really thank you for coming here today. This is one of the best interviews I've ever been a part of, at least in terms of the information. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
And I mean that sincerely. So I definitely want to do it again with you and have you back on the show and see how these things unfold. But I'm going to ask you one last final question, and kind of just hypothetical. If you had 5 minutes in front of the entire American public, uncensored and unfiltered, what truth would you want them most to hear right now?
Well, that's a good question. I would actually start with the education, right? And a lot of people think that's weird. Why, out of all the issues, would you start with education? I think that is really at the root of our problem. The reason Americans have been so easy to manipulate now over all these decades is because they have not been educated. The so-called education system is right now being not just nationalized, but globalized in a way that is indoctrinating, dumbing down, and sexualizing. And it's not even just the population of the United States anymore, but the whole world. And so I would urge all parents to start off with, in the strongest possible terms, to take immediate action to protect their children from this. I compare the system often to a burning building, right? If the building is burning and your children inside, you don't sign a petition, you don't call your representative, you don't go speak at the school board, you get your child out of the burning building. And so I would start with that. I would definitely spend some time on these monetary issues. If I had to pick the two biggest threats long-term to the survival of liberty, sovereignty, civilization, family, good values, it would be what's happening in the schools and what's happening with the monetary system. So I would certainly spend some time on that. And then I would absolutely share some truths from the Bible with folks and let them know that there are answers to all of those big questions in life that we have been told either not to think about or to come to silly conclusions about. And I would urge people in the strongest possible terms to open up their Bible. Many of your ancestors died so that you could have a Bible today. Many of them were burned at the stake so that you could have a Bible today. So at least do them the courtesy of reading what the Bible has to say. And I think all of us would be better off as a result of that. So those are the three things I would really emphasize. What's happening in the schools, what's happening with the money, and what's happening with the big questions of life. And I think the Bible has good answers actually for all three of those.
Yeah, no, couldn't have said it better myself. You're awesome, Alex. I wish you nothing but the best of success in your endeavors. And for people who have been inspired by what you had to say, I certainly am. What's the best way for people to continue to follow what you're doing?
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And this has been a joy and a pleasure and an honor. My personal website, libertysentinel.org. People can sign up for our free newsletter there. We send it out twice a week. I'm also senior editor at The New American. You can find us at thenewamerican.com or sign up for the print magazine. And then I'm a senior fellow at Classical Conversations. It's the nation's largest homeschool program. I actually have my own children enrolled there. It's a great, great program. And I'm on X, Alex Newman _JOU. So encourage people to connect that way. And thank you again, Andy, for having me on the program. It's been a great honor and a great pleasure.
You got it, brother. We're going to do it again for sure. And the honor has been mine. So until next time, I'll be looking forward to picking up where we left off.
Thank you so much.
You got it, man.
Little by Little with Andy Schechtman.